Before we begin, there are moments in life when silence feels heavier than sound, when something unseen presses against the edges of reality like it's trying to get through. And on a cold Monday morning at Ravenwood Military Logistics Annex, just outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that kind of silence was already broken before anyone even realized it had started. The sky was a pale steel gray, stretching low over rows of concrete storage buildings and chain-link fences that marked the perimeter of the restricted zone, where everything had a purpose and nothing was supposed to move without authorization. Yet at exactly 0600 hours, a white German Shepherd K9 named Ghost stood perfectly still in front of Structure 14B, his body locked in tension, his amber eyes fixed on a single point in the wall as if it had called his name. Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman noticed it the moment he stepped out of the tactical vehicle, boots hitting gravel, breath visible in the 42-degree air, his uniform still damp from early inspection duty. And he had seen enough working dogs in his 12 years of service to know that when a K9 stopped obeying the world around him, something was wrong or something was true in a way humans could not yet understand. Ghost didn't bark when Derek approached, didn't even glance back, just pressed his nose closer to the rough concrete surface, inhaling slowly like he was reading a story written in dust and time. And for a brief second Derek felt something he couldn't explain, not fear exactly, but the kind of discomfort that arrives when routine breaks in a place that is supposed to never break. The structure itself was unremarkable, a reinforced storage unit built decades earlier, sealed off after renovations moved operations to newer facilities half a mile east, its exterior marked with faded stenciled warnings and a security seal that hadn't been broken since the last inventory cycle. Yet Ghost kept returning to the same exact spot, circling once, then stopping, then leaning in again as if listening to something moving beneath layers of stone and silence. "Ghost," Derek called calmly, his voice steady in the way Marines are trained to keep calm even when nothing makes sense. But the dog didn't respond, only exhaled sharply against the wall, fogging the surface for a moment before it vanished into the cold air. A junior handler standing nearby shifted uneasily, glancing between the dog and the structure, whispering that Ghost had been acting like this for nearly 6 hours straight, refusing food, ignoring commands, even breaking formation during routine patrol rotation just to return here. And that detail alone was enough to tighten Derek's focus, because trained K9s did not deviate without reason, especially not Ghost, who had served through 2 overseas deployments and never once failed a command in the field. Derek stepped closer, placing a gloved hand against the concrete, feeling nothing but cold and static weight, and he turned his head slightly, listening, expecting nothing, hearing nothing, until Ghost suddenly lifted his head, ears locking forward, body going completely still in a way that made the air itself feel thinner, as if every sound in the base had been cut away at once. Then it happened, faint at first, almost dismissible, like the memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. A single knock from the other side of the wall, soft but deliberate, followed by a pause, then another, matching rhythm in a way that didn't belong to machinery or shifting structure. And Derek froze because he knew every vibration this facility should and shouldn't produce. And this was not on any list of possibilities he had ever been trained to expect. Ghost didn't bark this time, didn't move, just lowered his head slightly toward the exact point where the sound had originated, as if acknowledging something alive, something answering back. And in that moment Derek Coleman realized that whatever stood behind Structure 14B was not silent at all. It had been speaking the entire time, and only one of them had been able to hear it. Derek Coleman did not move at first, because experience had taught him that the moments after something impossible always mattered more than the impossibility itself. And in the cold morning air outside Structure 14B, the faint knocking sound did not repeat immediately, as if whatever was on the other side of the concrete wall was waiting to see if it had been heard at all. Ghost remained perfectly still, his entire body angled toward the exact point of contact, ears locked forward, tail lowered but steady, a posture that every handler on base recognized as absolute focus, not aggression, not fear, but recognition. And that distinction made Derek step back just slightly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the surface again. The concrete wall was thick, reinforced, marked with old serial identifiers and maintenance paint that had faded into uneven gray patches over time. and there were no visible access panels on this side. No utility boxes, no vents large enough for movement. Only a uniform slab that should have carried no sound from within at all. Yet Ghost shifted closer again, pressing his shoulder against it, letting out a low, controlled breath that fogged the cold surface. And for a moment Derek felt the irrational thought that the dog was not listening to the wall, but listening through it, like something on the other side had already established a connection that predated human understanding. A second knock came, slightly stronger than the first, followed by a pause that felt too deliberate to be accidental. And this time one of the junior technicians stepped back instinctively, whispering that it sounded like metal striking metal from inside the structure, though no one had authorized any mechanical testing in this sector. Derek raised a hand, signaling silence, and the entire team fell still, even the distant hum of generators seeming to fade as attention collapsed into a single point of uncertainty. Ghost responded immediately to the silence, not by calming, but by intensifying his focus, his nose tracing a narrow line along the base of the wall until he stopped at a specific seam where two concrete panels met. And there he paused, inhaling slowly, then exhaling in a way that almost resembled hesitation. Derek crouched slightly, placing his gloved fingers along the same seam, feeling nothing but cold stone. Yet the dog's behavior made him question his own certainty, because trained military working dogs did not fixate on empty space for hours without cause, and Ghost in particular had served in environments where his instincts had saved lives too many times to dismiss lightly. "Check internal logs for Structure 14B, Derek ordered quietly, voice controlled but firm, and one of the technicians immediately moved to a portable console, typing rapidly while glancing nervously between the screen and the wall, reporting after a few seconds that the building had been sealed for over 3 years following decommissioning of outdated communication storage units, with no active personnel assigned since then. That information should have ended the situation, should have closed the case in Derek's mind, but instead Ghost suddenly stepped back half a pace and let out a single sharp bark, not random, not repeated, but precise, and immediately after that bark the sound came again from inside the wall, clearer this time. 2 distinct knocks in sequence, followed by a pause that felt like response rather than echo. The junior handler behind Derek whispered that it was impossible for sound to travel through that much reinforced concrete without mechanical transmission, but the words sounded less like certainty and more like reassurance to himself, and Derek found his attention narrowing entirely on Ghost, who now stood completely motionless, eyes fixed forward, as if waiting for permission to continue listening. For the first time since arriving, Derek noticed something else, a faint vibration under his hand where it rested near the seam, subtle enough that it could have been imagined, yet consistent enough to repeat when he adjusted pressure, like something inside was establishing rhythm against the structure itself. Ghost responded again, not with barking this time, but with a soft whine, low and controlled, a sound Derek had only heard him make once before in a combat zone when the dog had detected movement no human radar could confirm, and that memory tightened something in Derek's chest, because it meant Ghost was not confused, he was communicating. Another knock followed, slower, deliberate, and then silence returned, heavier than before, as if both sides were waiting for the next decision, and Derek Coleman realized that whatever was happening here had already crossed beyond routine inspection, beyond training protocol, and into something that no one on base had been prepared to classify, because on the other side of Structure 14B, something or someone was answering back, and Ghost was the only one who had been speaking their language from the beginning. The air outside Structure 14B had grown heavier in a way that could not be measured by temperature alone, as if the entire perimeter had shifted into a quieter version of itself, and Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman found himself standing motionless beside Ghost. Both of them focused on a concrete wall that should have meant nothing, yet now felt like the center of a question no one had expected to ask. Ghost remained close to the seam where the panels met, his nose almost touching the cold surface, breathing slowly, steadily, as if trying to match rhythm with whatever lay beyond, and every few seconds his ears would flick forward in response to something no human ear could confirm. Derek kept his eyes moving across the structure, scanning for anything that could explain the repeated knocks, but all he saw was uniform industrial concrete, faded safety markings, and a long horizontal maintenance line that had likely been painted over during a renovation cycle years ago. Yet the dog refused to disengage, and that refusal was becoming the most reliable piece of information in the entire situation. Behind him, the junior technician reported that there were no active systems registered in this section, no electrical signals, no heat signatures, and no scheduled maintenance crews. But his voice carried less certainty with each sentence, as if the evidence in front of them was beginning to contradict the language they had been trained to trust. Then it happened again, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably deliberate. A sequence of 3 soft knocks spaced evenly apart, like a signal repeating itself in patient expectation, and this time even the air around the wall seemed to shift with it, drawing every eye forward at once. Ghost reacted instantly, stepping 1 pace to the left, then back to the seam, then pausing again as if triangulating the exact point of origin, and Derek noticed something subtle but unsettling in the way the dog's posture changed, because Ghost was no longer reacting like an animal detecting sound, but like a field operator confirming coordinates. Derek raised his hand again, signaling complete silence, and the entire team obeyed without question, even the distant background hum of base operations seeming to fade into irrelevance as attention locked onto the structure. For several seconds nothing happened, and that absence of sound became more oppressive than the knocks themselves, until Ghost suddenly pressed both front paws against the base of the wall, leaning in with controlled force, not aggressive, but intentional, as if testing resistance. And in response, a faint vibration traveled through the concrete that Derek could feel even through his gloves. He pulled his hand back instinctively, then placed it again in a slightly different position, confirming that the vibration was real, rhythmic, and localized to the same vertical section Ghost was focused on. And for the first time, Derek felt the uncomfortable realization that the structure might not be as sealed as its records claimed. A voice crackled from the handheld radio at his shoulder, asking for status update, but Derek did not respond immediately, because Ghost had just done something unexpected. He had stopped completely, frozen in place with his head tilted slightly upward, as if listening not to the wall anymore, but to something deeper within it. Then came the sound again, but altered this time, softer, slower, like a response shaped to match the presence on the outside. And Ghost gave a single low whine in return, a controlled vocalization that carried no panic, only recognition, and that single exchange changed the entire atmosphere around them. One of the technicians whispered that it sounded like communication, not random impact, and no one corrected him, because correction required certainty, and certainty no longer existed in the space between the dog and the wall. Derek took a slow step closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the seam again, noticing for the first time a faint irregularity in the concrete pattern, almost invisible unless viewed at an angle, a subtle deviation that suggested either a repaired section or an access point that had been deliberately concealed. Ghost moved with him, matching his pace, never breaking focus, and when Derek crouched again, the dog placed his head near Derek's shoulder, both of them now aligned toward the same exact point, as if sharing perception. Another knock came, but this time it was different, slower and spaced unevenly, followed by a pause that felt intentional, and Derek found himself unconsciously counting the intervals, realizing there was structure to it, a pattern that repeated just enough to suggest intelligence behind it. The realization did not come as a shock, but as a gradual tightening of awareness, like a door slowly closing around all other explanations, leaving only one possibility that no one was willing to say aloud. Ghost exhaled softly, then stepped back half a pace, maintaining eye contact with the wall, and Derek Coleman finally understood that whatever was inside Structure 14B was not simply making noise, it was waiting for acknowledgement, and Ghost had already answered first. The moment after the last exchange of sound, everything around Structure 14B seemed to settle into a suspended state, as if the entire facility had reached a silent agreement not to interrupt what was happening between Ghost and the unseen presence behind the concrete wall, and Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman found himself standing closer than before, his attention fully locked on the narrow seam where the faint irregularity in the structure had become impossible to ignore. Ghost remained perfectly aligned with that point, his posture no longer shifting between investigation and reaction, but held in a steady state of focused anticipation, as though he was waiting for the next response in a conversation only he could fully interpret. The air felt colder now, not because the temperature had changed, but because the absence of mechanical explanation was beginning to press against every assumption Derek had brought into the situation, leaving only observation and uncertainty. Then came a sound that was different from the previous knocks, not a single impact, but a controlled sequence, 2 short taps followed by a longer pause, and then another single tap, almost rhythmic, almost structured, and it repeated once more after a few seconds, as if confirming that it had been received correctly. Ghost responded immediately, but not with barking or movement this time, instead lowering his head slightly and exhaling a slow breath that fogged the concrete in a thin white layer, then shifting his weight to match the rhythm from the inside, like he was synchronizing with it. Derek felt his pulse tighten, because the pattern was no longer random in any sense that could be dismissed. It was consistent enough to suggest intention, and intention meant communication, and communication meant something inside the sealed structure was aware of them. A technician behind him quietly stated that no mechanical system in their database produced that type of pattern, especially not in a decommissioned storage unit. But his words trailed off before completion, as if speaking them too firmly might break whatever fragile understanding was forming in front of them. Derek raised his hand again, signaling the team to hold position, then slowly shifted his stance closer to Ghost, crouching down so both of them were now level with the seam in the concrete. And in that position, he noticed something he had missed before, a faint temperature difference along the lower edge of the wall, subtle but present, like air was moving through a space that should have been completely sealed. Ghost immediately reacted to that discovery, placing his nose directly against the seam and inhaling deeply, then pausing, then repeating the motion with increased focus, as if confirming a scent trail hidden within the structure itself, and Derek realized with growing unease that the dog was not simply responding to sound anymore. He was mapping something. Another sequence of knocks came, slower this time, almost cautious, and Ghost answered with a single soft bark, controlled and precise, then immediately went still again, as if waiting for acknowledgement. The silence that followed was heavier than before, stretching across the entire perimeter until even distant base activity felt remote, and Derek found himself unconsciously holding his breath as he watched the concrete wall, expecting it to remain inert, yet knowing it would not. A faint scraping sound emerged next, barely audible, like something shifting against metal from the other side, and Ghost's ears lifted sharply in response, locking forward with absolute certainty, while his body remained perfectly still. No tension, no hesitation, only recognition. Derek slowly extended his hand toward the seam again, stopping just inches away from the surface, then hesitated, because the logical part of his training still demanded a conventional explanation, but no conventional explanation fit what was unfolding. The technician behind him reported a slight fluctuation in acoustic readings captured by a handheld sensor, though the device was never designed for penetration through reinforced structures at this thickness, and yet it registered something nonetheless, a repeating low-frequency pulse aligned with the same rhythm Ghost had been tracking from the beginning. For the first time, Derek stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but to reassess the entire spatial alignment of the structure, realizing that every response had originated from the same fixed point, and that point had never changed since the first knock. Ghost then took one deliberate step forward and pressed his forehead gently against the concrete, closing his eyes for a moment, as if completing a connection rather than investigating a mystery. And in that stillness another knock came, softer than all the others, but perfectly timed to match his presence. Derek Coleman finally understood that whatever existed behind Structure 14B was not randomly producing sound or trapped by accident alone. It was aware of them in return, and Ghost had not been reacting to noise at all. He had been answering a call that had been waiting for him to arrive. The realization did not fade after it arrived. Instead, it settled over Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman like a weight that could not be set down, because once the idea took shape that whatever was behind Structure 14B was aware of them, every previous assumption about the situation stopped functioning in a normal way. Ghost remained in contact with the concrete wall, his forehead still pressed gently against the same seam, breathing slow and steady, as if maintaining a connection that required patience rather than force. And Derek found himself watching the dog more than the structure now, because Ghost was no longer reacting to signals. He was participating in them. Behind them, the technician adjusted a portable acoustic scanner, angling it toward the wall at the exact point Ghost had identified, and the device produced a faint waveform that flickered across the small display, unstable at first, then gradually aligning into a repeating pattern that matched the rhythm they had all been hearing. The technician frowned and repeated the scan, confirming that the signal was not environmental interference, but localized vibration traveling through a consistent medium, and that confirmation shifted the atmosphere again, because it meant the structure was not silent, it was structured. Derek exhaled slowly, then activated his radio, requesting an immediate engineering consult and a structural integrity review of Section 14B, keeping his voice controlled but noticeably lower than before, as if instinctively avoiding disturbing whatever process was unfolding in front of them. While he waited for response, Ghost suddenly lifted his head from the wall, ears locking forward, and took 2 slow steps to the right, stopping at a point approximately 3 feet from the original seam, then sat down without hesitation, as if he had found a second node in the same unseen system. Derek followed him with his eyes and noticed something he had missed earlier, a faint discoloration in the concrete at that exact height, barely visible unless the light struck it at an angle, suggesting either a repair patch or a concealed access modification that had been painted over to match the surrounding surface. The radio crackled with a response from base engineering, acknowledging the request and asking for clarification of urgency, but Derek did not immediately answer, because at that exact moment Ghost let out a single low bark, sharp and precise, and in response the knocking from inside the wall resumed, but changed pattern again. This time it was longer, more deliberate, a sequence of 4 measured knocks followed by a pause, then 2 shorter taps, then silence, and the structure itself seemed to absorb the rhythm rather than echo it, as if the sound was originating from somewhere within layers rather than bouncing between them. One of the junior personnel quietly stated that it resembled coded communication, though there was no official system in their database that matched the sequence, and no authorized transmission lines routed through this section, yet the timing was too controlled to dismiss as random structural noise. Ghost reacted immediately to the new sequence, shifting his weight forward and back once, then settling again into stillness, his posture mirroring anticipation rather than confusion, and Derek noticed something that tightened his focus further, because the dog was now responding with delays that matched the intervals of the knocks, as if he was learning the timing of the exchange. The engineering team arrived within minutes carrying a portable diagnostic array and a thermal imaging unit, setting up a live feed against the wall while maintaining distance, and as soon as the thermal scan activated, a faint irregular heat signature appeared in a narrow vertical band along the same seam Ghost had been tracking from the beginning. It was weak, inconsistent, but undeniably present, and it extended downward in a straight line that suggested either a confined space or a channel within the structure that was not documented in any schematics provided to the base. Derek stepped closer to the display, studying the fluctuation, then glanced back at Ghost, who had now repositioned himself directly in front of the thermal anomaly, sitting perfectly aligned with it, as if confirming the data visually rather than technologically. The technician pointed out that the heat signature was not stable enough to indicate machinery, but it was also too consistent to be natural diffusion, and that contradiction left only one possibility that no one wanted to state directly, that something living or actively regulating its environment might be behind the wall. At that moment the knocking returned, but softer, almost hesitant, and Ghost responded with a controlled whine that rose and fell in a pattern that felt strangely intentional, like a reply shaped to match the tone from inside. Derek found himself lowering his voice instinctively when he spoke next, asking engineering if there was any historical record of sealed compartments or emergency maintenance tunnels beneath Structure 14B, and after a brief pause the response came back incomplete, stating that records for this section were partially archived due to decommissioning protocol changes several years prior. The word partially caught Derek's attention more than anything else, because it implied absence rather than denial, and absence in a structure like this meant possibility rather than closure. Ghost suddenly stood again, walking a slow half-circle around the base of the wall, then stopping at a point directly opposite the thermal signature. And there he placed his paw against the concrete once, lightly, deliberately, and in response the knocking came again, immediately and precisely matching his action. The synchronization was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, and Derek Coleman finally understood that what they were witnessing was not random sound escaping from a sealed structure, but a deliberate exchange happening across a barrier that had only one participant on the outside who fully understood it. And that participant was not a human being, but the white German shepherd named Ghost, who had been listening long before anyone else realized there was something to hear. The engineering team's presence changed the atmosphere around Structure 14B, but not in the way Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman expected, because instead of resolving uncertainty, their arrival seemed to deepen it, as if every new layer of data only confirmed that the situation did not belong to any familiar category of field operations or structural anomaly response. Portable lights were set up along the base of the wall, casting a cold, white glow across the concrete surface, and Ghost remained directly in front of the thermal anomaly, his posture steady, eyes fixed, as if he was holding position in a conversation that required absolute attention. The engineers reviewed the live thermal feed again and again, confirming that the irregular heat signature was still present, faint but stable, and more importantly, it appeared to fluctuate in response to external stimuli, including movement near the seam and subtle vibrations in the ground. Derek stood slightly behind them, arms folded, watching the readings shift every time Ghost adjusted his position, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore the pattern forming between the dog and the structure, because every action Ghost performed was mirrored by a response from within. A senior engineer finally stated that while the structure was officially decommissioned, the construction records indicated layered reinforcement zones that were never fully documented due to budget reallocation during the final phase of expansion, which meant there could be internal cavities or sealed corridors not reflected in current schematics. That statement did not provide answers, but it created direction, and Derek immediately requested a full, ground-penetrating scan of the entire perimeter, instructing the team to focus specifically on the vertical section aligned with Ghost's repeated responses. While the equipment was being calibrated, Ghost suddenly shifted his attention again, moving closer to the wall and pressing his nose against a point slightly lower than before, then letting out a controlled sequence of short breaths that fogged the concrete in repeating intervals, almost matching the rhythm they had been hearing from inside. At that exact moment, the knocking resumed, but changed in intensity, becoming softer, more spaced, and significantly more deliberate, as if the source on the other side was adjusting to the increased external presence, and the synchronization between Ghost and the sound became even more precise. Derek noticed that the engineers had stopped speaking entirely, their focus now fully absorbed by the live feed and the thermal mapping, which showed a faint but distinct elongation of the heat signature downward, suggesting movement or airflow through a confined vertical passage within the wall. One of the technicians suggested the possibility of a maintenance void or emergency conduit, but his voice carried hesitation because no such feature existed in any accessible record, and the deeper they investigated, the more the structure appeared to contain undocumented space. Ghost responded to the shifting data without hesitation, stepping laterally until he was aligned with the lowest point of the thermal anomaly, then sitting down with absolute precision, as if marking a coordinate, and Derek found himself increasingly unsettled by how intentional the dog's behavior had become. The knocking came again, now reduced to a single tap followed by a long pause, and Ghost answered with a quiet, restrained vocalization that rose and fell in a pattern that no longer felt like instinct, but like structured response. The engineers adjusted the sensors again, increasing sensitivity, and for the first time a faint audio trace was captured through the contact microphone attached to the wall, producing a distorted but consistent pulse that matched the rhythm of the knocks almost exactly. Derek leaned closer to the monitor, watching the waveform stabilize into repeating intervals, and realized that what they were observing was not random vibration or structural settling, but a controlled sequence of signals being transmitted through physical barriers. A junior officer asked quietly whether it was possible that someone was intentionally signaling from within a sealed space, and the question hung in the air longer than anyone answered it. because acknowledging it would mean accepting that the structure had contained active presence without detection for an unknown duration. Ghost suddenly stood again, pressing both front paws against the wall, then stepping back and repeating the motion once more, and in response the knocking inside aligned perfectly with his movements, creating a direct cause and effect loop that no longer allowed for coincidence as an explanation. Derek felt a tightening in his chest as he observed the synchronization intensify, because each repetition reduced the distance between theory and certainty, until the only remaining variable was what lay behind the concrete itself. The engineers prepared a focused imaging sweep along the identified section, and as the scanner passed over the surface, it revealed a narrow vertical void that extended beyond the initial thermal signature, suggesting a continuous space that had been sealed rather than solidified. Ghost remained completely still as the results appeared, his head slightly lowered, ears forward, breathing slow and measured, as if acknowledging that the response he had been receiving was now fully confirmed. Another knock came, softer than before, almost hesitant, and Ghost answered with a single low breath rather than a bark, completing the exchange with a restraint that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. Derek Coleman finally understood that the wall was not the end of the problem, but the medium through which something had been waiting to be heard, and Ghost was not reacting to noise at all. He was responding to presence that had been speaking long before anyone else knew how to listen. The silence that followed the last confirmed scan felt different from everything that had come before it, because it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of recognition, as if both sides of Structure 14B had acknowledged that a boundary was no longer functioning the way it was intended to. Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman stood beside the engineering team, eyes fixed on the updated imaging display, where the vertical void inside the structure was now clearly defined, extending deeper than any standard maintenance cavity should have, narrowing slightly near the center before widening again near the lower section like a channel shaped by deliberate design rather than accident. Ghost remained still in front of the wall, but his posture had changed subtly, his head slightly tilted now, ears forward but no longer rigid, as if he was adjusting to a shift in tone from the unseen presence behind the concrete. The engineers spoke in low voices, confirming that the thermal signature had stabilized into a continuous pattern, no longer fluctuating randomly, but maintaining a steady rhythm that aligned with the acoustic pulses they had been capturing, and that alignment suggested sustained internal activity rather than isolated interference. Derek listened without interrupting, but his attention remained divided between the data and Ghost, because the dog was no longer reacting to each individual signal. He was waiting between them, anticipating the next exchange with a patience that felt trained rather than instinctive. Then, for the first time since the investigation began, the knocking stopped completely. The sudden absence of sound caused an immediate shift in the atmosphere, as if the entire structure had exhaled and held its breath at the same time, and even the engineers instinctively paused their input adjustments, watching the screens for any sign of continued activity. Ghost did not move at first, remaining in place for several seconds, then slowly took one step backward, then another, creating distance from the wall while maintaining visual focus, as if recalibrating his understanding of what silence meant in this context. Derek noticed the change immediately because Ghost's behavior no longer reflected engagement, but evaluation, as if the communication channel had temporarily closed. A technician suggested that the internal signal may have shifted frequency or entered a rest cycle, but before he could complete the thought, the thermal feed flickered once and then restabilized, revealing a faint but distinct pulse near the upper section of the void, different in location but identical in rhythm to what they had seen before. Ghost reacted instantly to that change, turning his head upward, aligning his body with the new position without hesitation, and letting out a single soft breath that fogged the air briefly before dissolving into the cold. Derek felt a tightening in his focus, because the adjustment inside the structure was not random, it was responsive, as if whatever existed behind the wall had detected their increased proximity and chosen to reposition its signal. The engineers quickly reoriented the scanning equipment, adjusting the vertical range, and within seconds the imaging confirmed a second channel branching from the original void, smaller but connected, suggesting a networked internal space that had never been documented in any construction record. One of the senior engineers finally stated that the configuration resembled intentional compartmentalization, though he stopped short of explaining what purpose such a structure would serve, because none of the standard applications matched the observed pattern. Ghost began to move slowly along the base of the wall, tracing the newly identified branch point with precise steps, stopping at intervals that matched the faint fluctuations appearing on the thermal display, as if he was following instructions written in a language that existed only between sound and vibration. Derek followed at a short distance, observing how the dog never once hesitated, never once returned to randomness. Every movement now aligned with measurable data, and that realization shifted the investigation from anomaly detection into something far more structured. Then, without warning, a single knock returned, but this time it came from a different location within the wall, higher than before, almost directly aligned with the secondary void identified on the scan, and Ghost responded immediately by sitting down beneath that exact point, holding still, as if confirming receipt. The engineers froze, watching as the waveform on the monitor stabilized again into a clear sequence, slower than before, but perfectly consistent, and Derek found himself unconsciously counting the intervals, realizing they now formed a pattern that repeated with mathematical precision. Ghost remained seated, head slightly raised, eyes locked on the precise point where the sound originated, and in that stillness the sense of separation between inside and outside began to feel less absolute, as if the structure itself had become a shared boundary rather than a barrier. Another knock followed, softer, almost tentative, and Ghost answered with a controlled exhale rather than a bark, maintaining the rhythm without breaking it. And for the first time, Derek Coleman understood that the exchange was not escalating. It was stabilizing, as if both sides had reached a level of communication that required no force, only acknowledgement. The engineers confirmed that the internal signal had shifted into a sustained low-frequency pulse, no longer intermittent, suggesting continuous awareness rather than sporadic response, and the implications of that finding settled heavily across the team. Ghost did not move again, remaining perfectly aligned with the source, and Derek realized that whatever was behind Structure 14B had not only been present the entire time, it had been waiting for a response that only one member of their team had been able to provide from the very beginning. The stillness that followed felt heavier than any of the previous moments at Structure 14B, not because something had stopped happening, but because everything now felt deliberately paused, as if both sides of the concrete barrier were holding a shared understanding that the next action would change the entire meaning of what they had been witnessing. Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman remained positioned just behind Ghost, his eyes fixed on the exact point where the last confirmed signal had originated, while the engineering team quietly monitored stabilized readings across both thermal and acoustic systems, each display now showing a consistent, low-frequency pulse that no longer fluctuated randomly, but held steady like a heartbeat measured through layers of stone and distance. Ghost did not move for several seconds, his posture perfectly aligned with the structure, head slightly raised, ears forward, body balanced in a way that suggested absolute attention without tension, as if he was waiting for something that required no further interpretation. Then, without warning, the rhythm from inside changed again, not in intensity, but in structure, shifting into a longer sequence of measured intervals that repeated twice, followed by a pause, and then a final single pulse that lingered slightly longer than the rest, creating a pattern that felt less like noise and more like instruction. One of the engineers immediately adjusted the decoding software on the portable interface, and within moments the waveform display reorganized itself into a repeating alignment that suggested intentional sequencing, not random vibration, and that realization caused the entire team to fall into a deeper silence, because structured repetition implied communication that was no longer passive but responsive. Ghost reacted instantly to the change, taking a slow step forward, then another, stopping precisely at the point where the thermal imaging showed the strongest concentration of internal fluctuation, and there he lowered his head slightly, as if confirming position, then remained still again, completing the motion with absolute precision. Derek noticed that the dog was no longer reacting to sound alone, but to timing, as if the intervals themselves carried meaning that transcended physical vibration, and that observation shifted something fundamental in his understanding of the situation, because it suggested that Ghost was not interpreting chaos, but decoding language. The engineering team confirmed that the internal signal had entered a stable cyclical phase, repeating at consistent intervals with minimal deviation, and while no known mechanical system in their database matched the pattern, the structure of the signal resembled a controlled feedback loop used in communication systems designed for isolated environments. At that moment, a faint mechanical resonance was detected near the lower section of the wall, not a knock this time, but a subtle shift, like something internal engaging a dormant mechanism, and the acoustic sensors picked up a secondary layer beneath the primary pulse, suggesting multiple channels of activity operating in parallel. Ghost immediately turned toward that lower section, stepping carefully along the base of the structure, stopping at a point directly aligned with the new resonance, and there he placed his paw against the concrete once, gently, without force, then withdrew it and waited. In response, the internal signal adjusted again, matching his action with a delayed but precise repetition of the same rhythm, and the synchronization was now so exact that even the engineers stopped speaking entirely, watching the exchange unfold in real time across their monitors. Derek felt a subtle shift in his focus, because what had begun as an anomaly investigation was now behaving like a structured dialogue, and every adjustment from Ghost was being acknowledged by the system behind the wall with measurable consistency. The engineers began mapping the full vertical profile of the signal, and the results revealed a continuous channel extending deeper than previously detected, with branching nodes that suggested deliberate segmentation of internal space, each node responding slightly differently, depending on the frequency of external input. Ghost moved again, this time tracing a slow arc along the wall, stopping at each node location identified on the display, and at every stop the internal signal responded within seconds, either through a knock, a pulse, or a subtle vibration shift, confirming that the structure was not only active but aware of spatial positioning. Derek stepped closer to the engineering console, reviewing the live feed as the system began to display correlation markers between Ghost's movements and the internal responses, forming a pattern of interaction that no longer resembled environmental noise but coordinated exchange. Then, without escalation or warning, the entire signal stabilized into a single continuous tone, low and steady, running through all detected channels simultaneously, and Ghost immediately sat down directly in front of the wall, completely still, as if acknowledging completion of a sequence. The engineers confirmed that the system had entered what appeared to be a sustained communication state, no longer reactive but maintained, and the implications of that shift were not spoken aloud, because everyone present understood that sustained communication required both origin and receiver to remain active. Derek exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on Ghost, who remained motionless in perfect alignment with the structure, and for the first time since arriving at 14B, there was no uncertainty in the dog's posture, only confirmation. The wall was no longer an obstacle or a mystery, but a boundary that had been holding a conversation long before any human presence had arrived, and Ghost had not discovered it by accident. He had arrived in time to complete it. The final state of Structure 14B no longer felt like an investigation site, but like a sealed moment in time where every variable had been reduced to a single living equation, and Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman stood quietly beside Ghost as the engineering team confirmed what the instruments had already been showing for several minutes. A continuous low-frequency signal flowing through all detected channels in perfect synchronization with the dog's position. The concrete wall, once perceived as a solid barrier, now registered as an active boundary layer with structured internal resonance, and every scan confirmed the same conclusion, that whatever existed behind it was not isolated, not random, and not dormant, but engaged in sustained communication that had reached equilibrium. Ghost remained seated directly in front of the central node, his posture unchanged for several minutes, eyes fixed forward, ears slightly angled, as if absorbing a language that did not require sound in the conventional sense, and Derek found himself unable to look away from the dog, because Ghost was no longer reacting to the system, he was aligned with it. The engineers reported that all fluctuations had stabilized into a single harmonic baseline, indicating that both internal and external signals had reached a matched frequency state, and that alignment suggested a completed exchange cycle rather than an ongoing search. Derek slowly stepped closer to Ghost, lowering himself to the same level, and for the first time since arriving, he placed his hand lightly against the concrete where the thermal and acoustic data overlapped, feeling nothing but cold material, yet fully aware that something on the other side had already acknowledged their presence. Ghost turned his head slightly toward Derek, not breaking focus, but adjusting his posture just enough to include him in the alignment, as if confirming that the exchange now had an additional witness. The engineers maintained silence, their instruments continuing to display stable output, and one of them quietly stated that the system appeared to be holding a steady communication loop, sustained without degradation, which in operational terms meant the signal was no longer searching for contact. It had already found it. At that moment, a final sequence appeared on the acoustic monitor, not a knock, not a pulse, but a layered pattern of 3 evenly spaced resonances followed by a prolonged, steady tone, and Ghost responded by lowering his head fully until his forehead rested against the concrete, completing a gesture that felt less like reaction and more like acknowledgement. Derek felt the weight of the moment settle across the entire team, because nothing about the data suggested confusion anymore, only completion, as if a long interrupted exchange had finally reached its intended endpoint after remaining unresolved for an unknown duration. The thermal imaging showed a gradual dimming of the internal fluctuation, not disappearance, but stabilization into a uniform state, indicating that whatever activity had been present had ceased variation and entered a resting equilibrium. Ghost remained in contact with the wall for several seconds longer, then slowly lifted his head and sat back into a neutral position, his gaze still fixed forward, but no longer reactive, as if the conversation had concluded without needing further input. Derek straightened slowly, his eyes scanning the engineers, who confirmed that all signals had flattened into a consistent baseline, with no additional variations across any channel, and the system had effectively reached a closed state. There was no sense of resolution in the traditional sense, only a quiet certainty that something had been fully understood on both sides of the barrier, even if the nature of that understanding remained beyond documentation. Ghost finally turned away from the wall, not abruptly, but with calm deliberation, and took a single step back to stand beside Derek, maintaining proximity without fixation, his role in the exchange clearly complete. Derek looked once more at Structure 14B, now silent in every measurable way, and understood that what they had witnessed was not an anomaly waiting to be solved, but a moment of recognition between 2 points separated by material distance, but connected through a pattern only one of them had been able to perceive from the beginning, and that connection had ended not in disruption, but in confirmation.